Hey all, today we're going to try something a little different and do a little lore walkthrough of the first variant dungeon, the Sil'dih Subterrane, or at least its first path. What's a variant dungeon, you may ask? A variant dungeon is an endgame exploratory dungeon with multiple paths that have their own multiple branches, as well as historical entries to unlock, aka an archon's wet dream. Now, variant dungeons as a whole is a format that I adore and bodes well for all sorts of exciting things in the future, like Ogamoro, the ruins of Dravania, Gelmora proper, and the secret Gabi city, and who knows what else lays within and beyond Eorzea. But before we start exploring the depths beneath ul'dah, let's get a quick historical recap on what Sil'dih actually was, as well as some surrounding background history that will be relevant. If you'd like a longer explanation, you can listen to our full lore talk over here. This next part is going to be a little dry. It's important information, but if you feel like you already know it or you don't necessarily need it, feel free to skip ahead from this section. That said, let's carry on. 700 years into the 6th Astral Era, Lalafelian descendants of the Maki traveled to the southern edge of Eorzea, to the region we know as Hydaelyn. Here, in the year 737 of the 6th Astral Era, they founded the nation of belah'dia, slowly growing into a great nation, rooted in the Maki's black magic heritage as well as the use of soulkin. The Belah'dians prospered. They worshipped Azima of the 12, most likely due to her relation to the sun, the symbol of their new desert home. They practiced such worship in temples like Karn, where you can see further examples of their soulkin creations. Belah'dia's symbols were the flame of magic and the fruit of knowledge, which will be relevant later. And though its remains are long since gone, remnants of its memory can be found all throughout Hydaelyn, even if its original location is unknown. So, what exactly happened to this once proud nation? After around 200 years of existence, in 969 of the 6th Astral Era, it was torn apart by two princes in a civil war, and split into two cities, ul'dah and Sil'dih. Both inheritors of belah'dia's legacy, ul'dah and Sil'dih were at each other's throats for nearly 200 years, culminating in an event known as the War of the Sisters in 1178. When Sil'dih's king diverted ul'dah's water source to his own capital, he was hailed as the King of Springs, but also ended up enraging the ul'dah. And when a drought hit a few years later, it was the spark that ignited the war between the sister cities. And thus, the War of the Sisters began. Ul'dah invaded Sil'dih to reclaim its water, and Sil'dih united to resist ul'dah's attacks. After 3 years of war, in secret, the Sultan of ul'dah turned to his thaumaturges to create an alchemical powder known as the Traitor's Sperm, which had the power to reanimate corpses and turn the living into the undead. Under orders from the Sultan, they used the Traitor's Sperm on Sil'dih, and in one foul move destroyed Sil'dih and its populace. Ul'dah then barred access to Sil'dih, locking away its living dead to fester beneath the sands. In ul'dah, the immoral act was discovered years later in the year 1224 by a man known as Baldr Thorn, who then threw a coup in order to imprison the Sultan for his crimes. Thorn's line would rule for the next century as stewards until the Sultanate could be trusted again. Thorn would be responsible for his own set of crimes, like enslaving the Hekaton Kyries, and their subsequent internment in the Copperbell mines. But history on the whole, perhaps problematically, judged his line to be fair and good rulers. Under the Thorn leadership, ul'dah's entire capital was moved on top of the ruins of Sil'dih in the year 1270, its dead still lingering below. 8 decades later, in 1353, without warning, the past broke free, and legions of undead streamed from the ruins beneath ul'dah. Unable to contend with the onslaught alone, the ul'dah sought help from the nearby Amalja, who agreed to rid their shared home of the unholy menace, unaware of who was responsible in the first place. Together, with the help of Alamegan mercenaries, they cleared out all the undead, and sealed Sil'dih away once more. Try saying that 5 times fast. This putting to bed of the past is what led to the Thorn dynasty handing the reins of rulership back to the Ul Sultanate. And 2 centuries later, in the year 1555, is the marriage of one such member of the Ul line, Sasabal ul Sisabal, to his wife Nanasha ul Nasha, the future parents of the current Sultana, Nanamo ul Namo. Only a few short years later, they would perish mysteriously, leaving their daughter alone in the world and without much in the way to remind her of her parents, besides a single key given to her on her 5th birthday. And then the Calamity, Gaius, Dragonsong War, Xenos, Ascians, literal embodiments of despair, and what have you. But you already know about that part. And that's where we find ourselves in modern day, excavating the ruins beneath ul'dah in the Sil'dih Subterrane. Assuming I haven't lost your attention thus far, let's get to the setup. We're drawn into things by a letter and a Sultana's request. Nanamo asks our aid in guiding her beneath ul'dah into the ruins of Sil'dih, via a path recently discovered containing a gate that only she has the key to. Now, there are two fundamental things that give us information as we go through our tour of this underground, and those are the diary entries of Nanamo, which we unlock as we go through each route, taking different actions to glean different insights, and which give us historical accounts and perspectives from Nanamo on primary sources. And the other key disseminator of information is the environmental storytelling. As we go through, I'll hit on both. Shall we begin? The Sil'dih Subterrane is accessed, unsurprisingly, through the Sil'dih excavation site, the same opening we fled out of during the Ul'dah banquet of 2.55. We know there are entrances into those underground networks of tunnels not only here, but in all manner of tucked away sections of ul'dah, including the Sultana's palace. During our flight, we were inadvertently part of a collapse of the tunnel, which ultimately revealed a gateway with a floral pattern, matching the pattern found on the key given to Nanamo by her parents. A pattern that we possibly see referenced later on in the Subterrane. Heading through the gateway, we begin our descent and make our first branching choice. In the entry hall, we are treated to 3 doorways, and a lovely piano rendition of To the Sun, which is Thanalon's daytime theme. The architectural stylings of the entry hall don't really tell us much, as they're pretty in line with most other architecture we see in Thanalon and ul'dah. What's more, since ul'dah was built on top of Sil'dih, and both take their legacy from belah'dia, the extent to which their architectures even differ isn't exactly clear. Our best example to disambiguate the two won't come until we cover the middle path, but since that isn't the purview for this path walkthrough, we'll talk about it later. Each path in the Subterrane plays into an overarching history of the sister cities, but also has a specific focus, with the left path, or Path 1 as I'll call it, being primarily about Nanamo's parents and the Ul line, the middle path, or Path 2, being about Sil'dih itself, and the right path, or Path 3, being about the Amalja and the fallout of the traitor's spurn, as well as a unifying secret section and boss that has to do with all 3. Joining Nanamo in Path 1, the very first thing we see is the irrigation system. The presence of water is a major element for each and every path, from irrigation to cistern to sanitation. The level of advancement and infrastructure around this water management is enormous, especially when considered to have been almost certainly constructed at least 400 years in the past, if not more. When such an underground network of channels, pipes, and drainways would have been constructed isn't made explicit to us, but the easy guess is that it would have been done by the King of Springs, Lalawefu Sil Tatawefu, the then ruler of Sil'dih, sometime in between 1162 and 1177 of the 6th Astral Era. There isn't any note of major associations with water and Sil'dih beforehand, and the redirecting of ul'dah's water to their own use would have enabled and required a mass engineering project to make use of it. Alternatively, Nanamo notes that ul'dah's own municipal waterways were routed through Sil'dih's ruins, giving them the name the Sil'dih Aqueducts. And with ul'dah's construction taking place atop the city's ruins and access points existing beneath the city, it's left unclear to what degree the ducts and causeways for water were crafted by one nation or the other. Though we do see the ground of our exit passage in 2.55 covered with water. So maybe it's merely these other ruins that ul'dah's water is routed through. Importantly, within the irrigation system we see no undead, and we will continue to see virtually no remnants of the traitor's spurn in the Subterrane. For the most part. And at the very least, none of it in this path, which is a testament to the thoroughness with which the Amalja and the Ul'dahs of the past cleared out these Sil'dih ruins. The creatures we do find are those like bats and ergonites, the former of which are cloudkin that are effectively identical to their real-world counterparts, if not more dangerous. Insect, fruit, or blood-eating, nocturnal, echolocation, the whole shebang. Nothing shocking about their presence, particularly in Path 1, as it's partially open to the elements at its later stages, and the dark dank environment of the Subterrane is perfect for their kind. Ergonites, on the other hand, are a little more interesting. Basically living fossils, they date back into the historical record to at least the 5th Astral Era, where they were farmed by the Nimians for meat. They also come in all manner of shapes and sizes, and in warmer climates tend to grow larger, such as those which grow to prodigious sizes in Upper Lenosia. How one ended up here is anyone's guess, though possibly trade with Vilbren could have accidentally ended with some of their kind being released into the waterways of Thanalon. These here are your standard size and scale, and while the waters of the irrigation system are probably pretty cool due to being underground, the ambient Thanalon sun likely keeps the flow of water from being too chilled. Back onto architecture though. Whether made by Sil'dih or ul'dah, it seems the pipes have not been maintained well, or as far as we know at all these past few centuries. The catch basins all along the path seem full of sediments, which would almost certainly impede their use, and one would assume that if the custodians of ul'dah did in fact have access to these zones, we'd see at least some basic maintenance. The creeping rust, clogging pipes, and debris scattered all around paint a decrepit picture, albeit a grand one. Thankfully though, all it takes is a little rambunctious fighting to break off a large enough section to allow us to continue on. Off to the sides of the chamber, there seem to be other means to access the section we're heading to, but how others in the past use those same gates in order to reach our final destination, I am not fully clear on. In the stone tunnels, we're told by Nanamo that we are currently yalms below ul'dah itself, which is an important note, as it places us soundly in geographic space, and means we have probably traveled a little southward from where we started at the entrance to the Sil'dih excavation site. We end up encountering mice here, which much like bats are not surprising, especially when similar rodents are abundant in the Thanalan desert above. And the eft we face are similarly natural. They're wavekin, related to salamanders, and prominent in central Thanalan. Since they love humid climates, their kind finding their way underground to hunt fish and other small game in the aqueducts is a natural consequence of their environmental preference. The puddings, however, are a little more surprising. Not the kind our floppy-eared moon native friend would like to dine on. Pudding, also known as flan, are void scents, made up of a mass of matter formed together in the void, and due to little intelligence and less strength, are regular intruders into our realm. Why a void scent is present in the Subterrane, though, is a bit of a head-scratcher. The existence of void scent in Path 1 doesn't have many easy answers, though as we will see in the future with other paths, there are other cases of void scent, but those have possible answers that lie within the Underground's history, whereas these are here. For the pudding, though, perhaps their gelatinous nature allowed them to form similar to an ashkin like a slime. Or perhaps the legacy of Mach and void scent summoning was not totally lost or excised from Sil'dih, the same way it hasn't been from ul'dah. Although, in thinking about it, with Sil'dih's symbol being the Helm of Might and the Grapes of Knowledge, they seem to have a focus on soulkin and military might over the traditional thaumaturgic styles of magic. Whereas ul'dah, with its own symbols, the Gem of Prosperity and, notably, the Flame of Magic, harkens not only onto belah'dia's thaumaturgy, but Mach's. It wouldn't precisely be shocking if ul'dah itself was to blame yet again. Now that we're further into the irrigation ducts, the sheer expansiveness of the underground facility becomes ever more clear. While Sil'dih itself as a city-state made up a lot of the fundamental architecture, the maze of water-shifting pipes and basins is staggering, especially in the span of time the city existed. With the far more limited technological resources of the middle part of the 6th Astral Era, it truly is a wonder. The sheer store of water calls to mind the aquifers hinted at in Nafka's Well in western Thanalan, or the falls of eastern Thanalan, and the scope of masonry infrastructure and mineral wealth required to make these systems rival the very city of ul'dah. Just a little further in, more eft are found, as well as a gaggle of mosslings. Mosslings are moss-covered seedkin, which love damp environments. Effectively sentient Marimo. Being damp-loving, they're much like the other creatures we've seen and will see, but what's interesting is that they're more commonly found in the lusher parts of Girabanya than in Thanalan, what with its dry environment. Since there's a long history of Alamegan mercenaries aiding ul'dah, not least of which in the cleansing of Sil'dih's undead, a group of mossling seeds may have ended up catching a ride with Girabanyans, or perhaps the waters of the Subterrane also fuel in from some source connected to the Shroud in Girabanya. Going along with the accrued filth and dirt of the catch basins, there's the culverts, whose pathways are also blocked up. At least the ones restricted from access to flowing water. A simple switch is all it takes to redirect the flow and clear the blockage, yet again, further alluding to the disrepair and disuse of, at minimum, these parts of the aqueducts. Even Nanamo comments that she's never seen a mechanism like it at work, which could indicate a lack of its use in ul'dah, or simply be part of her being a sheltered member of royalty. The water being freed also marks our first major change of possible course in Path 1. Keeping it as is will make the next boss arena dry as a bone, with one set of mechanics, and redirecting it will lead to the arena being surrounded by water and a separate set of mechanics for the fight to come. Speaking of, thanks to a hole in a nearby pipe, we're able to make our way into the silt pump. Though we access it from a water runoff pipe, there are doors to either side of the room that show a means for regular ingress and egress, for any confused to how someone would have normally arrived in the rooms further ahead. At the heart of the silt pump, we find a Hecaton Kyries, Garen the Steer. Now, why and how a creature like him ended up here is not made clear, and his existence in all paths further confuses the matter. But to explain it to the best of our abilities, let us start with the most important of all subjects: geography! See, up until this point, we've been roughly traveling beneath the streets of ul'dah, which we know thanks to Nanamo, but we've been heading due northwest. This leaves us in an area somewhere between western and central Hydaelyn, which would put us in line with the Sil'dih excavation site, though not directly. It also would put us very close to the Copperbell mines itself, where the Hecaton Kyries were imprisoned 300 years ago, and where they spent those 3 centuries tunneling beneath the ground and making a world for themselves. We see no specific tunnel in any of the paths that would explain exactly how Geryon would have ended up here, but setting aside the specific evidence, it is incredibly likely he is one of or a descendant of that group. He may also have simply escaped from the tunnels normally during the time we were handling the outbreaks in Copperbell themselves, but then how he ended up in a secret lost city sewer system is even more confusing. His title, the Steer, could be read as the Guide or the Shepherd, etc., which makes sense if he was the front line of tunnel exploration, and seeking to find a new home or resources for his kind. But until we get some more explicit information, this is all informed conjecture. His mechanics aren't anything to write home about, though they are quite similar to his Copperbell brothers, even with similar or identical names to Kodos. And the explosive barrels he brings may be indicative of mining explosives. Our actions with the culvert switch show their face here, with the water pouring from the pipes if water has been directed to the silt pump, or dry beds of silt occupying the battlefield at certain points if water hasn't been redirected. The fact that if the grime is left to sit, Nanamo suggests sending the palace custodians down to handle it, may point in the favor that they are meant to do so, or may just be her pointing out that now that we have ready access with her key, she'd send crews down to clear it all away. The historical importance of the site is such that you'd hope she'd do a myriad of other things to preserve the history first, but as we know, the preservation of history is not always the first and foremost priority. Coming out into the light and above ground, we arrive in the Spring Passage, almost certainly itself a nod towards the King of Springs, furthering the likelihood that the whole system was made during his reign. One thing notable is that all 3 paths of the Sil'dih Subterrane seem to also have a height associated with them, with the leftmost being the highest, since we're able to see daylight after straying out from below ground, and the rightmost the deepest, with its emulging camp seeming quite deep beneath the earth. With the Hydaelyn sun breaking through the ceiling of the Sil'dih structures and the pipe systems broken, it's not fully unknown where in physical space this location is, due northwest of the ul'dah Palace and merely hidden away or further within the desert itself. Most likely, based on the earlier comments about the irrigation systems being yalms below the streets of ul'dah, this area is somewhere between western and central Hydaelyn. The crack that's open to the sky most likely sits within or around a plateau that we can't readily see from a flying mount. But with water and sun aplenty, be it from general runoff or the broken pipes nearby, the vegetation in the nearby area is dense and lively, making a sanctuary that was and is used by many walks of life. Along the northern path we access, if we turn the water on to clear away the dirt and grime, we find a selection of odd fruits and enemies. The fruits are giant blue berries growing out of bamboo shoots? They do not look like any fruit I have seen on Atheris, and Nanamo, while commenting on their beauty, does not seem to recognize them either, making them unlikely to be common to Hydaelyn. If they seemed a form of grape, their relation to Sil'dih and its fruit of knowledge would make some sense. But as is, they're an alien oddity with no explanation I can particularly glean. The creatures, on the other hand, are a bit easier. The butterfly-looking vilekin are fluturini, and they are, while highly poisonous, very useful for creating alchemical concoctions. So even though they, like some other beings found here, are more commonly found in Girabanya, their import into Hydaelyn isn't all too surprising. Perhaps their love for the nearby fruit or its plants is the cause for their migration to or maintaining in this place. Though, when I think about it, hopefully their poison is not one of the ingredients of the traitor's spurn. The common gubu. You see, he's very interesting. Their lore is quite complex, and I'd love to get into it, but all you really need to know is that he's a goop boy. Depending on the RNG gods you get, instead of going north, you'll end up going west. Along the west path, we see much the same sights, but encounter a different host of creatures. Oedquan and Genomus. Of Oedquan, we currently know passing little, other than that Oedquan are void-sent, are possibly related to bombs, are primarily found in Thavnair, and when ground up make a delicious drink. No, I'm not kidding. We know this thanks to one near-suicidal alchemist who attempted to use one to craft an explosive brew, and in his failure, decided to drink his experiment. Genomists, on the other hand, are seedkin, carnivorous and feed on small mammals. Their presence within the Subterrane makes sense, save for how their seeds would have actually arrived here to begin with, since the only other location we commonly find them housed in is Labyrinthos. Perhaps maybe they were a more common sight hundreds of years ago. Beyond the north or west path lies a group of adamantoids and leafkin, the former of which isn't particularly common to this area, though there was a certain specimen that got out of Gegeruju's hands a while ago, and maybe its spawn ended up here? The other possibility is since these scalekin are native to Thavnair and first arrived in Eorzea accidentally via shipping carts, the active trade in ul'dah may have resulted in some few in Thanolin as well. As for leafkin, well, they've literally never been accounted for on Atheris as far as I know. That said, they have been known to exist in somewhere called Vanadil, and the only listed taxonomy I can find is asset reuse. Whatever that means. I'm gonna go with seedkin and move on. As we enter into the malachite portico, we need to take a moment to address its name. Malachite is a green gemstone, and its raw, unprocessed form can be gathered in eastern Thanolin. It's a common commodity in ul'dah, and likely would have been in Sil'dih as well, which means that the room's name could come from either nation. Another important aspect of malachite is a more personal one for Nanamo: noshicite. A brilliant and high-quality malachite found in Copperbell mines, and when the mines reopened post-calamity, it was discovered, or possibly rediscovered for the first time in likely centuries. It was given the name noshicite in honor of Nanasha ul'nasha, Nanamo's mother, for her startling green eyes, which Nanamo seems to share as well. Oh, and portico, because of the stone plinths that hold the ore bags? Or maybe just because it's a pseudo-porch-like structure leading into the deeper areas of the Forgotten Forecourt? Yeah, look, beyond the plinths for the ore, there isn't much in the way of columns, so I got nothing. More importantly, though, is the flower motif upon the door, floor, and portal, which according to Nanamo is the same one upon her key. Its infusion into the architecture and the magics of the building means that it's a symbol of Sil'dih. We'll also see it later on in the forecourt, and its possible inspiration in the sunlit gardens. The walls are lined with a decorative motif and with a deep purple the color of grapes, which notably could refer to one of the two symbols of Sil'dih, the fruits of knowledge. And purple is a color we also see in the floral symbols around as well, though sometimes they are more pinkish. This deep purple can also be spotted later on in the other Sil'dih architecture in Path 2, making it likely that it was, if not a common visual motif, then at least one associated with royalty, much like in the real world. Here, there is a split requiring us to solve a puzzle. The hint to do so is in another castle, another path. If we fail to solve the chamber's puzzles and gain access to the portal, we end up opening the doors ahead of us, and wind up in a room populated by more Odquan, some Leshy, and Yoshi's Island visual effects-inducing puffballs from hell. This is also where we get access to 2 of the 4 possible entries for this path of the Subterrane. One for if we kill all the foes without popping the puffs, and one for popping the puffs and killing the enemies. The Leshy are seedkin, and particularly good card game players, that are incredibly hardy, attested by the fact that their primary known location beyond here in Sil'dih is the Fringes, though they have some arguable cousins that may even go as far afield as Zadnor or Mercidia. Their ability to deal with more desolate environments, mixed with the ready supply of nutrient-rich soil in the Springs Passage and surrounding areas, makes this oasis in the desert a bizarrely fitting home, kind of a running point of interest for the seedkin throughout the Subterrane. The puffy flowers, on the other hand, are more of a mystery. Nanamo doesn't seem to recognize them other than noting their fluffiness, and the effect when popped is fairly similar to a dandelion, though they don't match any particularly known flora of Eorzea. There are some found later on in Path 1 of the Subterrane, but beyond that, they're exclusive to this one area. What's more, they bear a striking resemblance to Silky's palmtail, which itself is almost certainly a feather duster, since we know Silky to be a familiar of Nanamo's mother, a fact we'll touch on deeper soon. With that said though, it stands to possible reason that these fluffs may have played no small part in the inspiration for her cleaning utensil, and Silky's creation. Or they're just some acid trip-inducing flowers. Successfully completing the puzzle of the portico unlocks a teleportation portal to the Shaded Solace. Why such a contraption exists is anyone's guess. Setting aside the need for further game interactions for the path, one could wildly hypothesize some sort of mechanism of tribute for the Sil'dih royal line, with the appropriate amounts or quality of malachite allowing for special access. But that's literally me coming up with a theory out of my another Sil'dih Subterrane. Arriving in the Shaded Solace puts us directly face to face with snurbles and golems. Snurbles, funny enough, are classified under the taxonomy of elemental, though their bodies seem composed of physical enough furry matter. Once nearly hunted to extinction because their blood purportedly regrows hairs, having a population tucked away in the Subterrane would have kept poachers at bay. They're also found out and about in eastern Hydaelyn, meaning the desert under Hydaelyn's harsh sun is a homey enough environment for them. The golems are our first example of soulkin, which Sil'dih was known for. In other paths, we'll see many more examples of their kind, but for now, this is the singular example of Path 1. Soulkin, for those not in the know, are your traditional golem-like beings on Etheris. Inorganic and given temporary life via magic infused into a rock, metal, wooden, or other material body. The magic used to bring it to life allows it to draw aether into itself as a power source, and the capabilities of the being are limited only to the body created and the level of skill and power of the mage who summoned them. For a further breakdown of taxonomy, check out this video. Golems in specific, then, are soulkin made from clay, and are one of the most garden variety and crude, though effective, kinds. Most likely, these golems were employed in the care of Sil'dih to some extent, be it defense or cleaning. Whichever it was, they seem to have failed miserably on both accounts. This also marks the second set of 2 entries that we can get, one by defeating the enemies and walking straight to get to Nanamo, and one by heading over to the back corner. In the back corner of the Shaded Solace is a lone custodian's closet containing a single massive ewer. In so doing, Nanamo is prompted to tell us the ul'dah folktale of a magic ewer that could scoop up any amount of water at once, and was locked away after it drained an entire oasis. Now, if that was an actual magical artifact or a retelling of a historical event, like the King of Springs redirecting the waters of ul'dah, is up for questioning. But in this world, wondrous things and eldritch nightmares are both equally possible, and common. More interestingly is the ewer being of identical design to Famfrit's, the Lucavi faced at the Ritterana Lighthouse, with the Lucavies being tied to hopes and stories and the existence of Ultima's Aurosite on Hydaelyn for the last few thousand years. The connection may be a byproduct of shared imagery and legends, or simply not making developers' lives harder than they need to be. The last little tidbit in the Shaded Solace is the remnants of a set of cleaning tools. From Nanamo's entries, we know that her mother was fond of cleaning, a habit she had developed as a merchant's daughter, and one she continued to do even after marrying the Sultan. In spite of her love of doing so, as the new Sultana, her ladies-in-waiting did everything they could to prevent such an indignity, even going so far as to hide every broom and brush in the palace. One possible theory for these items is that they belonged to Nanasha, as Nanamo seems to recognize them, and as we find out in future entries, Nanamo's mother would meet with her father in the Subterrane. That said, Nanamo comments on the recent placement of the purple rug nearby, so perhaps these supplies belong to another recent guest, maybe even harkening onto a future path for the Subterrane. Past the portico and solace, we at last enter the groundwater intake and the forgotten forecourt. Open to the sun, the forecourt is a stunning appendage to the Sil'dih architecture. Whether used to hold gatherings or merely for some to enjoy the day in the oasis gardens nearby, it is the first time we get a much stronger hint at the beauty, not just the grandeur, of Sil'dih. The floral pattern on the arena in front of us is the same as the key, and the motif in the malachite portico, not only in the center, but around the edges. Though the rendition we saw in the doorway at the very start of all this is a slightly different example, the repetition of the motif is undeniable, especially with its possible connections to both the Sil and Ul line. Pipes carrying water still run through the architecture even here and beyond, which to me further implies that they were always running through this region, as its very design is built assuming them, despite being 100% Sil'dih. Now, let's talk about Silky itself, shall we? First off, yes, the tail is actually the entity controlling Silky, not the mouse. Secondly, no, it's not some kind of cordyceps cuteness zombie. Instead, what she is a Parago. Or more accurately, the Mickey broom things Matoya has. And by that, I mean a familiar. You see, Nanasha loved cleaning so much that when she was prevented from doing so, she played the ultimate Uno reverse spite card and hired a Charlian scholar to teach her the magic to summon familiars. To make one, you effectively take everyday objects or simple creatures and impart your will and aether into them in order to give them sentience and agency. What's really fascinating is that the sheer power of Silky means that Nanamo's mother must have been, if not an inordinately powerful mage, then in possession of an obsessive-compulsive disorder around grime that would rock the very foundations of Ishgard. When I mentioned the palm on its tail is the actual being, what I was getting at is that, while true, it almost certainly means that the item which Nanasha used as a foci for the familiar creation process was a feather duster, or similar cleaning object. Just like Matoya's brooms use a, well, broom. And just like the brooms, the root object turned into a familiar may be inanimate, but it is still blessed with intellect and ability. This is where the comment on the fluffy flowers from the portico section comes back around. If these puffballs were the root inspiration for the foci used to create Silky, then the similarities would make sense. The only other place we happen to see these flowers is in the Forgotten Forecourt itself, behind where Silky stands. Beyond its tail, its appearance is likely a reference to the colors of Nanasha and her daughter's hair and/or clothing, with pinks, reds, and light browns seeming to be a recurring visual motif. The crown on its head likely harkens to Nanasha's position as Sultana, too, and is in fact not a representation of Nanamo's persona, as we once thought. Silky's will to clean is so great, and similarly, its love for and desire to protect the sunlit garden that lies behind it is strong enough that it attacks us on sight. The general disrepair of most of the Subterrane and its filth would lead me to think that it keeps itself to its master's beloved region and nowhere else. Nanamo herself speculating that one of her mother's acts in her final years would have been to send Silky to look over the garden as she became more entrenched in court politics, with less free time. Silky's attacks, for the most part, being elemental and cleaning related, are what you would expect of a familiar. But one notable skill it has is the creation of a magic ewer that pour, or more accurately, blast forth water, matching the ul'dah myth. Based on Nanamo's surprise, she had not known Silky was of her mother's invention, though she had heard of its existence before, as a sort of cleaning familiar that had not been seen around the palace in many years, resorting to asking Papashan about it in order to learn its history. Nanamo also speculates that this was likely due to the conflict between the royalists and the monetarists worsening, which is also an important note for future paths. And hey, isn't it wonderful how the more things change, the more they stay the same? Once the Immaculate Rat is taken care of, we are allowed final access to the last zone of our first path, the Sunlit Garden. The Sunlit Garden, still set for tea and conversation. Chairs and tables that Nanasha and Sasabal must have used to while away their days, is a sanctuary within an oasis within a hidden city lost to time. Based on its veranda and the garden's open nature, its purpose in the time of Sil'dih likely wasn't all too different from the use it was put to by the previous Sultan and Sultana, though perhaps less secretly. The flowers themselves are unique, with none like them elsewhere in the Subterrane, or all of Hydaelyn. The intake water and plentiful nutrient-rich groundwater soil that makes up its bed will likely keep the flowers thriving for years to come, beneath the Hydaelyn sun, as they have these past centuries. But when we look at the imagery of the flower and its repeated motif throughout this path, I can't help but think that they must have meant something to the Sil'dih. What, beyond their beauty though, is possibly lost to time? I'd like to take this time to read entry 3 in its entirety because I think it's fundamental to understand the importance of this place, both in ul'dah's history and to Nanamo. He, a member of the royal family, she, the daughter of a modest merchant house. They met at a palace banquet, an opportunity to mix with notables of commerce, and it was love at first sight. Ah, I adore that story. It is so very romantic. Mother would go on to tell me of the secluded place her and father would visit ere they were bound in marriage, of a sun-dappled garden at the end of a secret tunnel, where they could enjoy each other's company away from prying eyes and judgmental stares. In other words, a perfect description of the sanctuary we discovered on our recent foray. When they did at last announce the details of their engagement, the location of this magical place where father proposed to mother became the subject of much rumor and debate. I am told that the city's merchants, being the same incorrigible creatures that they are now, seized upon this furor to turn a tidy profit. They never did come close to the truth of it, but after visiting the spot myself, 'tis easy to see why it has remained undisturbed. I imagine the two of them in their younger years, whiling away an idle morning amidst the dawn-kissed petals, their haven protected beneath a barrier of Hydaelyn's scorching sand. And I cannot help but smile. Never until now have I managed to think of them without a pang of sadness. Have I been captive to grief for so very long? The beauty of this story aside, exploring the Sil'dih Subterrane is the first time we have gotten a good glimpse of the sort of people Nanasha and Sasabal were, let alone what they looked like. This is going to go on to play an incredibly important role in the secrets that await us in Paths 2 and 3, the enigmatic truths behind Nanamo's key, and the ancient halls that lurk around the corner. But that's going to have to wait for next time. When I started this video, I may or may not have intended to encapsulate all paths, but looking at the well over 6,000 words of semi-inane information we've covered, it's probably best that I split it up. With hints of future paths, or at least branches, to come, leaving the room to build on things seems the right way to go. But what do you think? Are there any interesting ideas you've gleaned from this walkthrough? Do you have any of your own speculations and hypotheses on the history of Sil'dih, or just what variant dungeon you'd like to see next? Well, I would love to hear them down below. The Sil'dih Subterrane has given us one of our most expansive looks at the nation-state and sister city Lost to Time, and I'm so excited not only to venture down its 2 other paths with you, but beyond into the future, when we explore new frontiers of history, on this star or any other. For now, here on Atheris, tucked away in a small corner of the world in a silent sanctuary, I think I'll drink my tea and take a pause before venturing on. In the meantime, stay safe, Archons. Thanks for watching. Hey all, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, praise the 12 by giving it a like and comment, or by subscribing. It goes a long way to helping the channel. Don't forget, new videos every week, and if you want to engage with us further, why not check out our Discord and Patreon in the link below and become a part of our community. With that said, see you around, fellow Archons.